Ethical Perspectives on the News is produced by the Interreligious Council of Linn County, which is solely responsible for its content. The views and opinions expressed on this program do not necessarily reflect those of the staff and management of KCRG TV 9.
Good morning and welcome to Ethical Perspectives on the News. My name is Bill Farrell and I'll be moderating this week's show. During our time here together, we'll be talking about socioeconomic issues in schools. Now recently this issue has been very prominent in the news as the Iowa City Community School District has moved to enact a new diversity policy which reads in part, "It shall be the policy of the board to provide equitable learning environments for the students attending the Iowa City Community School District. It is the board's policy that greater diversity and enhanced learning will be the result of establishing the following diversity goals." Now, we won't read through each of these goals this morning. However, in general, the policy works to find a balance between the different schools in the Iowa City Community School District by looking at a percentage of the students that take part in the free and reduced lunch program. The district has presented information that appears to show a correlation between the free and reduced lunch program and low academic success. Today we'll be discussing socioeconomic issues related to the Iowa City diversity policy and look at whether this policy can be effective to improve the academic achievements of the students. We will also look at socioeconomic issues in a broader sense, discussing how this subject has been around for many, many years, and it will likely continue to grow in importance as our cultural makeup in our schools changes in this rapidly changing world. This morning we have three guest panelists, and I'd like to introduce those to the show and welcome them. So Carl Cassell of the Cedar Rapids Civil Rights Commission.
Good morning.
Welcome. Carla Reeds, who is a district facilitator at Cedar Rapids Schools. Good morning. And Jeff Carlson, who is the opinion editor at the Iowa City Press Citizen.
Good morning.
Good morning. Thank you very much for being here. So let's kind of look at the issue from socioeconomic issues and concerning academic achievement. Are those really something that are related to each other? Carla, would you mind taking a shot at that?
Oftentimes the socioeconomic of a child's status is related to how they achieve in school, only because of other factors that impact that. Sometimes children of poverty have less access to quality health care, or they may not have opportunities for enrichment activities, print in books at home. All of those are factors on academic achievement that are sometimes more common in houses that are in poverty.
Okay, so is this looking at the free and reduced lunch program, does that seem like that would be an effective way to address the issue?
Well, that would be one indicator.
Okay.
That would be one indicator.
Sure. So Jeff, this issue seems to really be getting people's attention, especially in the Iowa City area. Could you give us a little bit of thoughts on what you're hearing about the issue?
What we're hearing about the issue is talking about all the schools in the Iowa City School District, specifically the elementary schools, where the range of students who qualify for free or reduced lunch is wide, from kind of the mid-single digits to nearly 80% in some schools. And while this is just one of many markers, it's kind of a shorthand that people have been using for identifying poverty. And it is also the marker that the Supreme Court has said that school districts can use for this purpose, as opposed to race or other things that is more constitutionally suspect in the Supreme Court's mind. This is one that has stood up before the court, although some of the cases are still being challenged.
Okay.
And as Carly was saying, that free and reduced lunch rates by themselves aren't a perfect indicator, especially at the University of Iowa. If you go out to some of the married student housing areas, those students probably would qualify for free and reduced lunch rates because their parents are students. They're not making a huge amount of money, but their relationship with school and education is very different than children that are in cyclical generational poverty.
Right. So Carl, does this seem like this is a fair way to look at academic achievement?
It depends. I often look at it from the standpoint that these are children, blank slate of opportunity. The emphasis put on these children, academic success, is based on the people who are teaching them. If it's looked at from the vantage point that there's no hope, then they will be treated like that. If your expectation is that this child will be a successful student, I think the dynamic changes and the opportunities for them to be successful student changes as well.
Okay, so my understanding that is at some point you have to identify, if you're trying to balance different schools and the free and reduced lunch program, somehow you have to identify how you're going to do that and identify I guess the students that you're going to move to a different school. Does that seem like that would be something, I mean, talking about an issue of identifying the children, seems like you would be pinpointing one child and saying, okay, you're the one with the issue, or you're the one with, you follow where I'm going with that? So what are your thoughts on?
Well, identifying one child is never something that we want to do, and we would never want to discourage parents from accessing free and reduced lunch or services that their family needs, because they would be concerned that they might be identified. So looking at those rates maybe in a broader sense might be a way to handle that, but identifying children is certainly not something we would want to do.
Right. Jeff, is your understanding in Iowa City that that's part of the way this would be implemented?
For right now, as I understand the policy and talking to those what they were intending with putting the policy in, and then what the language actually says, they are not focused, they're not looking at identifying individual students. There are some provisions that might be the case, but that will be in the implementation. But in the broad, they're using aggregate data. They're using this information the way it is used for other programs as well, and the way it has been implemented in other cities and throughout other services that the district would offer. The one case that I can see in the policy where it would identify individual children is where they talk about, Iowa City has a very lenient policy about transferring from one school to another. That lenient policy would have to get a little more tough if all of a sudden that they're going for this more FRL division amongst the students. It might be that a student who wants to transfer to a different school might, there's a provision in the policy that it would make it difficult for them to transition or might stop that. That's the one area of the policy where I can see that it would single out a child, and I think that that's the one area that they would have to be very careful about doing that for parents who don't want to identify themselves. Other than that, the information that's being used is primarily FRL status in the aggregate, so you couldn't identify any one individual student.
Okay, so but at some point you still have to move the students around. And isn't there some sort of a stigma that's going to be attached to that in, I guess, either direction if you're getting moved around?
Well, and that would be my concern, what that does to the child. Because I remember at a time being in the Cedar Rapids Community School District, you had a lunch card that was a different color if you were free or reduced lunch. So at some point, there's identification measures that are taken. If there's dollars attached to that kid in terms of state or federal funding, you're going to have to attach those statistics to the number of students you have. Then you start breaking that down to how many kids transferred in, and then you start identifying kids potentially one by one. And so I'm always weary that they would be identified, or there would be a stigma with it, or everyone would know the kids moving into this school are on free and reduced lunch.
Right, right. Now let's, I guess, look at this issue just a little bit from a different perspective. If, let's say that we can implement a policy and we find that the numbers become more equal amongst all of the schools. Does that, or is there studies, or is there information that says that that in fact does lead to academic success, so that the overall numbers within the district would be better?
I think you need to address the problems that are associated with poverty. Just redistributing so that there are equitable numbers won't necessarily make or ensure that the family has access to health care. They won't, it won't ensure that there's summer programming for students. So addressing the needs of the kids, and irregardless of what building they're in, would be the critical piece there.
Right. So,
I was going to say the educational scholar that a lot of the people in Iowa City who are supporting this diversity policy name is Richard Kallenberg. And his research has found that basically that type of socioeconomic mix is beneficial across the board for the students. Now, not surprisingly, educational theorists and classroom teachers sometimes disagree about what's actually best. Some of them are looking at it from 50,000 feet, others of them are looking at them in the classroom itself. The policy as written doesn't say that a certain amount of kids are going to move to different schools or how it's going to be. In fact, how that policy is going to be implemented is a blank slate, if you will, that's still something that they're trying to work out. But I guarantee that it won't involve busing students across town or other things that would identify some students because I just don't think that there's the stomach in the district to actually make that move to implement this policy. There's still a lot of questions about how that's going to be. And until those questions get answered, these concerns are worth talking about.
right, right.
And I would say many times it's good to have children of varying backgrounds, socioeconomic, race, obviously gender in different classrooms because it gives you a realistic understanding of how society is. Academically, it pushes kids either to try harder or causes kids to revert back. And so a lot of times that's dependent on the child. You mentioned busing kids. My attitude is if there are a lack of resources in the schools, give the same resources to the schools that are lacking instead of taking them to other schools where obviously the resources are better. It costs money to bus if that would be an option. The money you would spend busing, allocate those resources into the school so that there is a greater opportunity to keep kids in their neighborhood schools.
Right. I mean, I think the goals of what's going on are admirable.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I think we'd all love to see that the academic success of the kids improves. The question becomes, how do we actually, can we make that happen? Carla, do you have other ideas on how the issue can be addressed?
Well, what really makes a difference for academic achievement is quality instruction, and that's really what needs to, for all kids, irregardless of their socioeconomic level, that needs to be in place and supported by district resources.
Right.
That ultimately is the best for all kids.
Right, right. So, Jeff, do you hear other ideas being floated around about how,
to the degree that this is going to be implemented, it can't be separated from Iowa City schools now having passed a revenue purpose statement that allows them to borrow up to $100 million for meeting some of their infrastructure needs for new schools. As they're talking about building some new elementary schools, this will play in for how they redefine those boundaries. So rather than disrupt neighborhoods, it's going to be part of more of a holistic process of we're already putting these new schools into place. We need to start looking at socioeconomic data as we are redefining these, redrawing these boundaries. So yes, I think that will be part of the discussion, but it also will be that what Carly has discussed, that those kind of committed, energetic, enthusiastic, and creative teachers are in those schools that already have a high FRL. And the school board members who are been pushing the strongest or the most passionately for this are also looking for magnet school options, thinking more creatively in terms of pairing schools. Instead of two different K through 6 schools, have one be a K through 2 school, one be a 3 through 6 school, and some kind of sister school opportunity that would further mix the socioeconomic levels without involving a lot of busing. There's still, again, the implementation of those still has a lot of questions and still makes people nervous. But I think this policy is more the old idea that you have to throw your hat over the wall, that, okay, we've thrown our hat over the wall, now we've got to figure out how to climb over and get it back. If this pushes them to be more creative in their in the curriculum and the different things that they offer, it will be beneficial for the district overall.
Right. You know, in my experience, where schools go is where the houses are being built or where the jobs are. And this would be a very different way of trying to look at building schools and locating those schools. What I believe typically happens is you put a school in, it becomes a neighborhood school, and that is a driver for more development around that, which typically isn't the lower income areas of town. Is that kind of what you would see?
Yeah, and that's where I struggle, because if kids are moved out of their neighborhoods, extracurricular activities, those things that they would participate in after school, the enrichment, if they're spending half an hour, 45 minutes traveling back and forth to and from school, they miss those opportunities. And so to take kids out of their immediate communities to go somewhere else to school has some disadvantages. And so we see a deterioration of schools that are in core neighborhoods because the bigger, better homes are outside. They're building schools with state-of-the-art facilities in suburban communities. Well, then those resources, the best teachers are put there, and then kind of your revolving administration and teachers are put in some of your core neighborhoods, and that doesn't bode well for the students if they're not seeing that consistency in their schools, and parents see that as well, and it leaves a level of dissatisfaction.
Right. So, Carla, is there ways that we can try to address that as new schools are built, or just trying to get that balance in the quality of the educator district? And I know, well, all districts really.
Every district that I'm aware of always works very hard to increase quality teaching and get as high a quality educators as they possibly can. Efforts to balance that, I think, I know nationwide there sometimes are incentives to teach in different schools, maybe that are in higher poverty areas. I'm not aware of any of that locally where that occurs, but I suppose that might be a possibility as well. I think in the schools that I'm aware of, or in Cedar Rapids especially, we try to keep high quality teachers in all of those schools and provide the same professional development irregardless of where the teacher is teaching. So.
Right, but Carl does bring up a good point. When the new schools are built, it's the newest everything. Yeah, if I'm a teacher, I'm going to want to teach there. Granted, there's some ideas where you want to get out and help those that are in the greatest need, right. But still, if you have, you've got the resources over here to be successful, then that would be, I think, what most teachers would go after. Most human beings go after that.
That can happen, but teachers typically teach for different reasons than a nice building. Mm-hmm. So they sometimes like working with kids who maybe are more needy. That may be their area of expertise. So I'm not sure that you would have a huge outflux into just a new building.
Right. Jeff, are you seeing is there serious discussion that you're hearing about how to actually implement something other than putting a school where the development's going?
Very much so. I mean, one of the driving forces of this was, especially for Iowa City residents, were concerned that the district had been building new schools throughout in other cities, and there hadn't been a proper new school in Iowa City in decades as well. So part of this is this relationship between schools and development. The schools choose a place that's in a growing area, but then that area grows more because the school is put there as well. And so they are hoping to equate that. That's one of the things that they're talking about, building a new elementary school in Iowa City, which will address some of the boundaries on the east side. How that's going to play out on the west side is something that needs to be still talked about. Now, and again, just for your point as well, for taking people out of their core neighborhoods, one of the problems is philosophically you can't both have this push for a more even distribution of FRL numbers and a strict commitment to neighborhood schools. At some point, you've got to balance them out, because some of the neighborhoods are themselves, where the higher poverty neighborhoods, there needs to be something that's offered there to bust them out or to bust other people in. How that's done is another question, but that's not what's being talked about so far. And the board members who are backing this most will say that their dream is not to bus people. The time frame that's on the policy leaves people wondering how they're going to actually meet those goals other than busing. And yes, I think the pressure is on them to come up with something, to work with administration and to make sure that people know that it's something that can be done.
Right. I mean, I think it's admirable that they're talking about it, but it seems like it's a little bit of they put the policy jumped into place, and then we're trying to figure out how to actually make it happen. I see where, the cultural changes in the Iowa City, Coralville area are happening are in the areas where the housing is less expensive, and socioeconomic issues are going to keep rising rapidly. I think in those areas, granted, there's cultural diversity happening far different than it was 20, 30, 40 years ago. So, Carl, do you see that same kind of trend?
Yeah, and I think sometimes what happens is we attribute socioeconomic to race. If we just base it on the numbers alone, the higher number of kids in poverty are still not going to be kids of color, just because of the numbers. It's impossible for that to be the case. And so what happens is we always direct it to diversity, socioeconomic, forgetting that there's a lot of kids that are going to fall into that. And based on what we're seeing happening in society right now with loss of jobs and manufacturing and downsizing, there's going to be a lot of people caught in that net. And so we want to be very careful that we're not targeting policies based on racial diversity, and understanding that socioeconomic, for the most part, is still balanced the other direction. It's not perceived that way or even articulated that way. And that always makes me nervous when we get into this conversation.
Right. And that's, go ahead.
I was just going to say that is one of the tricky parts of this policy. At the beginning, it defines minority as being someone who qualifies for free and reduced lunch. The reason for that is to make it in line with a diversity policy on the state level. To the supporters, that's just a legal terminology that they need to do. To the detractors of the policy, it makes them seem, rather than say, for the purpose of this policy, minority equals someone who qualifies for free and reduced lunch, it sounds like saying, for the purpose of this policy, purple is a primary color. Or for the purpose of this policy, 2 plus 2 equals 5. That those terms are so ingrained that people have a hard time buying the legal rationale for it. Again, how it plays out is going to be one of the big questions that comes from this.
Right. Carl, is that, I mean, I see you, and that's
Yes.
definitely a concern.
Yeah, it's a concern, but that's how we kind of do things, and we use these words or phrases as a cover to institute policies that are geared specifically to people. And I would say, based on the numbers in Iowa, if there's an 8%, even less than, I'm thinking of Cedar Rapids, but 4% population of kids of color in the state, if we think of socioeconomic, there's more kids that aren't kids of color that fall in that net. And so I think we want to treat children, because it's the parents who are struggling. But if we're talking about educating our children, not even waiting till they get to elementary school, we need to start looking at preschool programs. We really need to value the education of our children differently and not equate it. And I understand dollars are attached to every kid, but dollars are going to be attached to every kid who becomes an adult later on. And so that's how we should approach it, looking at the end result. And if we do this the right way, it'll pay itself back.
Right. I mean, there's some obvious dangers to this, but is it good that we're at least addressing the issue?
Yeah, I think anytime there's dialogue on issues such as this, that's always to our advantage. But I think there has to also be a thoughtful approach to how we deal with things, and so that becomes my concern. So they have to be willing to listen to a diversity of voices.
Right,
Yeah.
right. Is there a conversation that you're part of that is addressing, socioeconomic issues and balancing and
Not that I am not aware of any of those conversations. We always try to address the needs of all of those kids. And I would agree with Carl in the fact that it's not a race issue. It's just there are lots of disadvantages that come with poverty.
Right.
And trying to overcome those disadvantages for the kids and their families.
Right, and I know there's a tremendous amount of kids in Cedar Rapids that were impacted by the floods.
Absolutely.
And that was a very broad range of, not so much socioeconomic,
No.
as I think it hit, the lower incomes harder than it did many others. I worked in some of the flood areas, and it's still a struggle to see that come back. But what I have seen is there's been a fair amount of resources that appear to be put into the schools that are in those impacted areas. So does that sound?
I know that how we spend the same amount per pupil irregardless of what building they're in. So that doesn't matter. And I'm not sure about facility. Okay. I couldn't answer that questions about facility money and how that is spent exactly.
Right. So Jeff, do you see things working out in a positive way as we're kind of messily making our way forward?
Messily making our way forward is a good way to describe it. And sometimes the mess is necessary in order, because the solutions to these are not crystal clear. And in fact, when they are presented as crystal clear and obvious, it's usually by somebody who hasn't thought out all of the parameters or all of the variables that they need to think about. So yes, I'd like to be optimistic that we are moving forward. I've seen Iowa City go through this in the past in 2010 when there was a district-wide discussion over redrawing school boundaries at almost every school. That did not show the community at the best, but I do hope that that if they have thrown their hat over the wall, that they are actually going to live up to their promise to scramble over and find something other than busing, other than all of these other kind of easy solutions, quick solutions, and do something truly creative.
Let me ask you this. It seemed like when the policy first was presented, it was presented in kind of a rapid, here it is, we're going to vote on it right now fashion, where it didn't seem like there was a whole lot of inclusion in that process, and that may have led to some of the more emotional discussions.
Certainly didn't help, yes.
Has it toned back a little bit from that now?
That it has passed. There's a little less momentum and drama that's attached to it, but people are. If it's toned down, it's because people are waiting to see what the implementation is. They realize that the policy has passed. Now the job is to make sure that the implementation is done in as fair a way and helpful a way as possible. If that shows that it's not going to be done, then I think all that anger and frustration will come back. I hate to say twofold, but it will come back. Right now, people are just waiting to see what the next step is.
Right. So it seems like we've got some really good things going on. There are some brave people that have gone out and tried to address a really challenging issue. So I want to thank you all for being here this morning. This is, again, a tough issue. And thank everyone for viewing us today.